Hello and welcome to this first lecture of a new section on analyzing strategic interactions in this course, Master in Game Theory. So in this section, we will give you an overview of in-depth view of not overview, in-depth view of analyzing strategic interactions. And in this lecture, we will talk about how to identify if any player has a dominant strategy, a strategy that is best regardless of what the opponents do, right? So let's take a look at that. So analyzing strategic interactions in terms of the dominant strategy requires us to identify if there is a strategy that is best for the player regardless of what others do. And how to identify if such a strategy exists? Any thoughts? Okay. So let's look at how to identify this. So to identify if any player has a dominant strategy in the game, what you need to do is three things. First, you need to construct the payoff matrix. Create a matrix where the row represents the strategies of one player and the columns represent the strategies of another player. Now, each cell in the matrix shows the payoff for the combination, each combination of strategy, player 1 and player 2. And then you, for each player, you compare the payoff, analyze the payoff. You, for each player, you compare the payoff of all their strategies against each possible combination of other players. And then you identify dominant strategies. A dominant strategy is one that results in the highest payoff for the player, regardless of what the other player or players do. And there you compare the payoff of each strategy. If the playoff strategy consistently results in higher payoff compared to all other strategies, regardless of the opponent's move, it's a dominant strategy, right? So three things: construct the payoff matrix, analyze each player's strategy, and see if there is a strategy that results in higher payoff regardless of the opponent's strategy. And that becomes the payoff, dominant strategy. Let's consider the prisoner's dilemma where there are two players, player 1, prisoner 2, player 1, player 2, and they have two strategies, cooperative and defect, each one of them. And the payoffs are represented as -1 and 1. If player 1 cooperates, he gets 1 year of imprisonment. Player 2 also cooperates. Both cooperate, they get each -1. If both players do not cooperate, they defect, they confess, both get higher sentence of 2 years. If player 1 cooperates with in terms of remaining silent, but player 2 defects, the first player gets 3 years imprisonment, second goes scot-free, and so like this. So that's the payoff matrix. So we have constructed the payoff matrix. Then what you need to do is to analyze each player's strategies, right? So there what we look at is for player 1, what are the strategies? If there, it depends on the player two's strategy. If player 2 cooperates, player 1 can cooperate with getting 1 year sentence, as the player 2 will also get. And if player 2 defects, if player 1 defects, he goes scot free. He gets a zero imprisonment. And if player 2 defects, then the player 1 can cooperate, getting -1 and -3 years imprisonment. And if he also defects, he gets a 2 years uh, imprisonment. So that's how it happens for player 1. Now the player 2 similarly has strategies. If player 1 cooperates, if he cooperates, he gets 1 year imprisonment. If he defects, he gets 3 years. And if player 1 defects for player 2, then and if player 2 cooperates, he gets 0, he gets scot free, and if he defects, he gets 2 years imprisonment. So these are the different strategies of players. So there are, you can see there are four combination of strategies and eight possible payoffs. So player one cooperates, CC, CD, CCCD, right? Cooperate, defect, cooperate, defect, cooperate, defect, cooperate, defect. So there are four combinations. Now let's go on to analyzing seeing whether there is a dominant strategy. Let's look at first for player 1. Now if player 2 cooperates, so we'll examine for player 1 what will happen to his or her payoff in each of the scenarios of player 2. So if player 2 cooperates, right, then what is the good option? Should player 1 defect or should player 1 cooperate? So there we see defecting is a better than cooperation because he gets a 0 imprisonment versus -1. So player 1 should defect if player 2 cooperates. Now so that if we let's look at if player 2 defects, what happens for player 1? So there again we see here if for player 1, if player 2 defects instead of cooperating, defection is a better strategy than cooperate. Again, why? Because with defection he get lesser imprisonment of 2 years versus cooperating 3 years. So what we see here is that in any case for player 1, whether player 2 cooperates or defects, the defection is a better strategy. So defect becomes a dominant strategy for player 1. So you get an idea of identifying dominant strategy. So player 1 will always defect irrespective of what the player 2 does, whether the player 2 cooperates or defective. The payoffs are set up in such a way that it is better for player 1 to defect in either case. So player 1 becomes a dominant strategy. So defection becomes a dominant strategy. Similarly, let's take a look at player 2 now. What happens for player 2? Now, if player 2, if player 1 cooperates, defection is a better strategy than cooperate for player 2. Why? Because the payoffs are in favor of defection. You know, player defection, player 2 gets a 0 versus -1. And if player 1, for player 2, if player 1 defects, right, then in that case defect again is a better strategy than cooperating because of the payoff that is again better. -2 is better than cooperating, right? So therefore we see here that even for player 2, defection is a better strategy, right? He, in any case, whether player 1 cooperates or player 1 defects, the player 2 will always defect because that's how the payoffs are set up. So we see here again that player 2 again has a dominant strategy. And in this example, we see both players have a dominant strategy of defecting. So like this, we identify the dominant strategy, right? So what are the steps in general? Let's kind of summarize. So what do you do to identify the dominant strategy exists in the game? So first you list strategy, as we said, write down all strategies for each player. You saw that in example. Then you compare the payoff for each strategy for the player against each possible strategy of the other player. And then you identify dominance. A strategy is strictly dominant if it always provides a higher payoff than any other strategy. Now there is also a weakly dominant strategy if it provides a payoff at least as high as other strategies and sometimes higher. So that's how you identify dominance, and then you repeat for all players. Perform the comparison for each player in the game, and by systematically comparing their payoff for each strategy combination, you can determine if any player has a dominant strategy, right? So having looked at how to identify dominant strategies, what do we do next? We will now look at analyzing the Nash equilibrium. What is Nash equilibrium and how can you find out if this in the game there is a Nash equilibrium? So thank you so much for watching this first lecture on analyzing strategic interactions. I hope you're continuing to learn new things, continuing to enjoy. And I do look forward to see you again in the next lecture. Please feel free to message me if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer your question. And also download the PDF file to take a look at anything that you need to do, especially those dominant strategy parts and the comparisons.